Today I want to talk about gender in fantasy. I've been reading some books recently that touch on the simply the binary mostly between men and women in fantasy. Um, but also I've been lucky enough to read some books that feature non-binary characters or also center on trans characters and non-binary characters. Um, and how they're viewed sort of through the lens of the fantasy world, I thought was interesting to talk about. Obviously, you're looking at, three cis dudes here, so with a grain of salt, I guess. But well, we'll do our best to, shed some positive light on this topic here. But here's one of my things where I had some issues with gender representation in fantasy. So, first being women are often represented mostly in like three different ways. One being like the damsel, which we're all probably familiar with. Um, Also, probably all familiar with like the sexual deviant villainess. That's a very common trope. And then revenge fuel. So you killed my wife. That's why the story's happening, or my mother, or my sister, or my family. But very seldom, or not often, do we ever see like women get their own story or character growth or development of any sort. They're just sort of there to further serve the plot in the eyes of men. So obviously that's pretty problematic. And then when we talk about like trans non-binary representation in fantasy, I'd say like probably the most problematic thing is there's not enough of it, but also when it does happen, it's always like othering. So you might get a trans or rather a non-binary character, but they're always like an alien or a robot or a race that doesn't represent or doesn't recognize gender. They're never human. So it sort of highlights that there's like this, like humans aren't capable of understanding this. And so we have to use different races to sort of highlight this thing. Are these things, I'm bringing up things that you guys have, experienced while reading fantasy stuff?
I guess I'll go. I wouldn't say so much reading, but I think that how characters are written, maybe like I always find like the best way for like a female, I'm just saying like speaking like I guess talking like female protagonists is like one of my favorite is the I'm forgetting her name. I'm so sorry. From Rogue One. What's her name?
Oh, Jyn Erso.
I think that is like a staple center for just like writing a character because like through that experience, she like is it's not really she's like a girl. She's just like someone who's trying to find her father, and through that whole kind of story she has, it's not like it doesn't like feel like she's like oh like because she's a girl, these are this kind of circumstances he has. So I think like the best thing to do, even just like writing fantasy as well, it feels like the person is like the person like just I guess it wouldn't matter like the range of like their sexuality or how they identify themselves is like always like a cool topic to bring up, but I find like the best characters aren't they're more focused on like their piece in the story rather than like what their gender is. Not that it's like a bad thing, but I always find it's kind of like a like even like with a guy like or like just some like character who's like macho just like oh I've like read that I don't really care like this
Yeah.
guy just like another weird feature to throw in. That's like not that it's ever a bad thing, but I always find it's just like a interesting when I'm reading through and it's not that's something that pops in my head. I'm like, oh my God, like I love this person. Like they're just doing some cool shit. And I'm like, this is so sick. But it kind of takes away from the character, I think, in my opinion. I don't know.
Yeah, I think Jyn Erso is a pretty great example of like avoiding tropism when you
That's
have a
that's
woman protagonist, because like I think especially telling those stories again, a bunch of cis dudes talking about this, so
yeah.
but
Sorry.
I think it's important that it's like we recognize when those stories are about like human woman characters, like the aspects of being a human woman are sort of being taken into consideration. But when it's something like Star Wars, it's like this character should just be a character, and it should almost be like their gender should almost be irrelevant, because like that sort of sexism isn't always present in other fantasy worlds, because we don't have to carry that same weight of our own society with us when we make these worlds and stuff. So like I think that's one of the benefits of like telling stories where gender is sort of like a you know main sort of topic, is that when you do it in a fantasy setting, you can sort of flip things on their heads so they're not the exact same way we would see them. Even something like Wheel of Time, where like you know the power in that story is like women hold all the magical power in that story. And you know, we see like even in that story how like power can corrupt a little bit. And you know, we see like women who are like hunting men. I'm speaking only towards the TV show. But you know, it's sort of interesting to like view things through the lens that's not our own world history. And I think gender is like a really cool way to do that, especially in alternate sort of universes. Will, any initial thoughts on gender in fantasy?
Uh, I mean, I guess that, like along the lines of like representation, I think. Well, I think in the past couple of years, there's definitely been a more like a larger trend for like representation, but like a lot of times I've noticed it's like super awkward. Uh, like a I don't know, and I think like kind of just like how you and Jack were just talking about like how you should just write them as a character and kind of make the gender irrelevant while also having representation is a little bit better. Like I think of like as an example would be like Mass Effect Andromeda when that dropped a couple of years ago. That was like a pretty big, I guess, conversation. It was a lot of this, maybe less gender, but a little bit more like sexual representation. But like it was also like very like on the nose. Like it was kind of like almost like a marketing thing, which I thought kind of like cheapened it. But I don't know.
Right.
I don't really know how to like word it better.
Yeah, no, I it's sort of a tough topic to navigate, obviously, but I think it's like
I don't want to speak for anyone else.
It's not to say like gender should be irrelevant, but I feel like it's when you put things in the context of like our real world and bring that into fantasy, I almost think like it's almost weird for me that like as a writer you have the ability to create a new world.
Yeah, so,
and
like
so like
normalize it.
Obviously like you shouldn't write utopias if that's not the story you're trying to tell, but like I don't know, sometimes it just feels like, you know.
That's the best thing about writing fantasy, man. It's a lot of fun. Like going back to Mass Effect, you could be piping an alien and then piping a dude in the next like cutscene. So it's just like, you know, it's fun, man. You just like you play around with it. It's fun.
Yeah.
As long as it's like as long as the character's good in like any aspect, it's always enjoyable.
Yeah. I think for me, like moving forward, having that sort of representation in fantasy sci-fi is super important. I think the things to look out for, because I think when you get it, when like Will, you were saying, like it feels forced, feels like marketing sometimes. And I feel like those examples are always because it's like either like a studio or like overhead decision being like, we need to have this because this community, we can appeal to this demographic. And they never actually speak to those people. Like, you know, what would you like representation to look like for you? Do you know what I mean? Like if they came to us and we're a bunch of dudes being like, gender is irrelevant, you know, I'm sure like women might be like, those aren't the stories we want to hear. Like we would like to hear what it might be like us in a fantasy universe. So it can certainly, so I think like consultation and, you know, trying to represent the community means you need to speak to that community and be given like, you know, the pass to represent them, which I don't think happens often enough. And I guess like, not having to bind yourself to establish real world gender norms just to be able to tell a story about gender. If people out there want to consume some, you know, non-binary or trans fantasy, Pet by Akwaeke Emezi, The Black Tides of Heaven by Ji Yang, Dreadnought by April Daniels. Those are some ones you can check out. Also, I have just off screen here, She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. I don't know if this is picking up on camera. Really cool book. It's like a retelling of some Chinese myth and stuff like that. And it's got a really cool central character who I guess you could sort of view as a trans character throughout part of the story, and then sort of steps more into the role of like a non-binary character at points. So it's a really interesting book that has to do with gender. It really sort of dives into like the internal monologue of a character who is, you know, experiencing and discovering their gender within themselves. So check that out. Some other books, Last Shot, Star Wars book, has some non-binary characters, as well as Black Sun, Rebecca Roanhorse, really cool story about, you know, pre-Columbian American culture. So check that out as well. But yeah, I will toss over to you now, Jack. What do you got for us today?
All right. So it's kind of cool. It's kind of a first experience for me. But I was, I guess, like the viewers are listening, I was telling the boys earlier, I purchased an orc set, an orc starter set for